Sarah Martinez had never imagined that mucking out horse stalls could feel like a blessing. But after 3 months of unemployment and a dwindling bank account, she was grateful for any work that came her way. The Clearwater Ranch sat nestled in a valley 20 miles outside of town, surrounded by rolling hills that turned golden in the afternoon sun. When she'd answered the classified ad for a barn maintenance worker, she'd expected the usual: cleaning stalls, feeding animals, and keeping equipment organized. What she hadn't expected was the profound silence that seemed to envelop the place like a heavy blanket. Tom Clearwater had hired her with barely more than a handshake and a quick tour of the facilities. He was a man of few words, weathered by years of ranch work, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under the sun and probably longer nights worrying about everything from cattle prices to weather patterns. His wife had passed away 2 years earlier. He mentioned briefly during her interview, leaving him to raise their 3 children alone while managing a 1,000-acre cattle operation. Sarah could see the exhaustion in his shoulders, the way he carried himself like a man who never quite had enough hours in the day. The children were rarely seen during those first few weeks. 8-year-old Emma, 6-year-old Jake, and 4-year-old Lily were usually at school when Sarah arrived each morning at 7, and by the time they returned in the afternoon, she was often working in the far pastures or the equipment shed. She caught glimpses of them occasionally, Emma's long brown braids bouncing as she ran toward the house, Jake's muddy boots abandoned by the back door, or Lily's high-pitched laughter drifting from somewhere near the chicken coop. But they moved in different circles, and Tom seemed to prefer it that way. Sarah's days developed a comfortable rhythm. She'd arrive as the morning mist was still lifting from the pastures, brew herself a cup of coffee in the small break room Tom had set up in the barn office, and begin her rounds. The horses, 6 beautiful quarter horses that Tom used for herding cattle, would nickering softly when they heard her footsteps, knowing that breakfast was coming. She'd learned each of their personalities quickly. Thunder, the big bay gelding, was gentle despite his imposing size. Whisper, the gray mare, was skittish but responsive to his soft voice. Star, the paint horse, was curious about everything and would often try to untie Sarah's bootlaces with her teeth while Sarah worked. The barn itself was a massive structure, built sometime in the 1940s with thick wooden beams and a hay loft that could store enough feed for the winter months. Sarah took pride in keeping everything organized and clean. She'd sweep the aisles until they gleamed, arrange the tack room with military precision, and ensure that every tool had its proper place. There was something deeply satisfying about transforming chaos into order, about knowing that every halter hung on its designated hook and every feed bucket was scrubbed clean. But it was during her lunch breaks that Sarah began to notice the children more closely. She usually ate her sandwich sitting on a bale of hay just outside the barn doors, where she could watch the activity around the ranch house. Emma often emerged around noon, carrying a book and settling under the big oak tree between the house and the barn. She was a serious child, Sarah observed, the kind who seemed to carry more responsibility than her 8 years should have required. She'd glance toward the barn occasionally, but always looked away quickly when she caught Sarah watching. Jake was more adventurous, often disappearing around the corner of the house only to reappear minutes later with dirt on his clothes or a collection of interesting rocks in his pockets. He reminded Sarah of her younger brother at that age, always moving, always exploring, always getting into minor trouble that wasn't really trouble at all. But even Jake's energy seemed subdued somehow, as if he was consciously trying not to be too loud or too demanding. And then there was Lily, the youngest, who seemed to carry an invisible weight that no 4-year-old should have to bear. She was often seen clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, its pink fur faded from countless washings. She rarely strayed far from the house, content to play quietly on the porch steps or in the small garden her mother had apparently started before her death. The turning point came on a Tuesday in late September, when an unexpected thunderstorm rolled through the valley just as school was letting out. Sarah was in the hay loft, organizing the winter feed delivery that had arrived that morning, when she heard the rumble of the school bus followed by the sound of running feet and slamming doors. The storm hit with the sudden intensity that was common in their part of the country, bringing with it sheets of rain that drummed against the barn roof and wind that howled through the gaps in the siding. She was climbing down from the loft when she heard it, soft sobbing coming from somewhere near the barn entrance. Following the sound, she discovered Lily huddled behind a stack of hay bales, her school clothes damp from the rain, and her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear, and she flinched when a particularly loud crack of thunder echoed through the valley. "Hey there, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, crouching down to Lily's eye level. "Are you okay? That was pretty loud thunder, wasn't it?" Lily nodded, her lower lip trembling. "Daddy's in the south pasture fixing fence," she whispered. "Emma's helping Jake with his homework, but the thunder scared me. Mama used to hold me when it thundered." Sarah's heart clenched at the simple statement. Without thinking, she settled down on the ground next to Lily, leaning back against the hay bales. "Would you like to sit with me until the storm passes? I was just taking a break anyway, and sometimes storms aren't quite as scary when you have company." For a moment, Lily hesitated, glancing toward the house. Then another rumble of thunder decided for her, and she quickly scooted closer to Sarah. Within minutes, she had curled up against Sarah's side, her small body fitting perfectly in the curve of Sarah's arm. The stuffed rabbit was sandwiched between them, and Sarah could feel the tension slowly leaving Lily's small frame as the storm raged outside. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rain on the roof and watching the lightning flash through the barn windows. Sarah found herself humming softly, an old lullaby her grandmother had sung to her years ago. Lily's breathing gradually slowed and deepened, and Sarah realized the little girl had fallen asleep against her chest. When Tom finally returned from the pastures an hour later, his rain slicker dripping and his boots caked with mud, he found them exactly like that. Lily curled against Sarah's chest, both of them peaceful and dry while the storm continued outside. He stood in the barn doorway for a long moment, water pooling at his feet, just watching. Sarah looked up and met his eyes, expecting him to be upset that she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. Instead, his expression was unreadable. He walked quietly across the barn floor, his wet boots squelching softly on the concrete. "Storm caught you both, I see," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper so as not to wake Lily. "She was scared," Sarah explained, unconsciously tightening her protective hold on the sleeping child. "I found her hiding behind the hay bales. I hope it's okay that—" Tom held up a hand, stopping her explanation. "She hasn't slept that peacefully in months," he said simply. "Usually takes her at least 2 hours to calm down after a thunderstorm." He was quiet for another moment, studying his youngest daughter's relaxed face. Her mother used to hold her just like that. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. She looked down at Lily's peaceful face, at the way her tiny hand had somehow found its way to clutch at Sarah's work shirt. "I can move her if you know." Tom's voice was firm but not unkind. "Let her sleep. Storm's not quite done yet anyway." He settled down on a nearby hay bale, pulling off his wet hat and running his hands through his damp hair. Been a long time since any of them looked that relaxed. They sat in companionable silence while the storm finished its business outside. Sarah couldn't help but notice the deep lines of exhaustion around Tom's eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the world. She'd seen single parents before, had been raised by one herself after her father had left when she was 12, but there was something particularly heartbreaking about watching this strong man struggle with burdens that seemed too big for one person to carry. When Lily finally stirred an hour later, the storm had passed, and golden afternoon sunlight was streaming through the barn windows. She blinked up at Sarah with sleepy eyes, then seemed to remember where she was and who she was with. For a moment, Sarah expected her to pull away, to be embarrassed about falling asleep on a relative stranger. Instead, Lily smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from any of the children. "You're warm," she said simply, as if that explained everything. And you smell like horses and hay. I like that smell. Tom chuckled softly from his perch on the hay bale. Your mama always said the same thing. Said I brought the best parts of the ranch inside with me. His voice was wistful, and Sarah could see him retreating into himself again, building up those walls that kept his grief and exhaustion hidden from his children. But Lily wasn't ready to let the moment pass. She sat up, but remained close to Sarah, her small hand still resting on Sarah's arm. Can I come visit you again? She asked. When I get scared or when the thunder comes back. Sarah looked at Tom, not wanting to overstep any boundaries. He was watching his daughter with an expression she couldn't quite read. Part surprise, part relief, part something that might have been hope. After a long moment, he nodded. I think I would be okay, he said quietly. If Miss Sarah doesn't mind, of course. I'd like that very much, Sarah said, and she meant it. There was something about this little girl, about all of these children really, that called to something deep in her heart. She'd always loved kids, but had never had any of her own, and she'd forgotten how natural it felt to comfort a frightened child or to simply be present when someone small needed reassurance. As they walked back toward the house together, Lily's small hand tucked securely in Sarah's, Tom fell in a step beside them. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice meant for Sarah's ears alone. She hasn't trusted anyone new since. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. She's a special little girl, Sarah replied. They all are. You're doing a good job with them, you know. It can't be easy. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Some days I wonder if I'm enough, he admitted. If what I can give them is enough to make up for what they've lost. Sarah wanted to tell him that love was always enough, that his children were lucky to have a father who cared so deeply about their well-being. But she sensed that Tom wasn't the kind of man who would be comfortable with easy platitudes or empty reassurances. Instead, she simply said, they know you love them. That counts for more than you might think. That evening, as Sarah was finishing up her work and getting ready to head home, she noticed Emma and Jake hovering near the barn entrance. They'd been watching her work for the past hour, she realized, though they'd kept their distance. When she looked up and smiled at them, Emma stepped forward slightly. Lily said you held her during the storm. Emma said, her voice carefully neutral. She said you were nice. Your sister was scared, Sarah replied simply. I just sat with her until the storm passed. Jake moved closer, his 6-year-old curiosity overcoming his shyness. Do you know how to milk cows? He asked. Dad's been trying to teach me, but I'm not very good at it. Sarah laughed. I'm still learning myself, actually. Your dad's been showing me the ropes. Maybe we could practice together sometime, if that's okay with you. The boy's face lit up with the first real enthusiasm Sarah had seen from him. Really? Dad says it's important to know how to do ranch work, but sometimes I don't understand what he's trying to show me. Emma rolled her eyes with the practiced superiority of an older sister. Dad doesn't explain things very well sometimes, she said. He just expects you to know stuff. Sarah could hear the frustration in the girl's voice, the burden of being the oldest child in a family that was still figuring out how to function without its matriarch. Well, she said carefully, maybe I could help explain some things. I'm still learning too, so I remember what it's like to not know how everything works. The children exchanged a look, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Emma nodded. Maybe that would be okay, she said, if Dad says it's all right. As Sarah drove home that night, winding her way through the darkening hills toward her small apartment in town, she found herself thinking about the day's events. She'd taken the job at Clearwater Ranch because she needed work, plain and simple. But somewhere in the space of a few hours, sitting in a barn with a frightened little girl sleeping against her chest, something had shifted. She'd seen the raw need in this family, the way they were all trying so hard to be strong for each other while struggling with losses that were too big for any of them to carry alone. She thought about Tom's admission that he sometimes wondered if he was enough for his children. She thought about Emma's careful composure that seemed too old for her 8 years. She thought about Jake's eagerness to learn and his frustration when things didn't come easily. And she thought about Lily, sweet